you very much. Very pleased indeed to be here. I'm Sanjay Reddy. What I'd like to do is to speak a little bit about how the discipline of economics has in recent years attempted, or as the case may be, not attempted, to understand the patterns of income distribution which have emerged in the world, in particular in the last 25 to 30 years, and in what ways it has understood, or again, as the case may be, not understood, the contribution of globalization to this pattern, these patterns. And by way of beginning my account in this regard, I wanted to ask you to recall the workhorse models, as it were, of international trade theory and of international economics, which I'm sure that you were exposed to in graduate school, or indeed have taught from, or are being exposed to now if you're a current graduate student. And in particular, the Heckscher-Ohlin, Vanek-Samuelson model of international trade. I recall certainly that when I was a graduate student in economics in the 1990s, and there was considerable discussion of the economic consequences of globalization, there were rather simple-minded messages which were propounded, and I think it's fair to say that they were influentially propounded, citing the standard framework as justification. And in particular, the headline message derived from the so-called 2x2x2 model and the Stolper-Samuelson theorem was very influential in determining how social scientists generally, not only economists but others, political scientists in particular, who heavily used this headline message, understood the process of globalization. And as you know, the main argument therein was that the income distribution consequences which would be expected from globalization in a world in which there was the abstraction that there were only two countries or two zones, north and south, and there were only two factors of production which mattered, labor and capital. And of course, to complete the picture, only two goods, would be that the income distribution in labor-abundant, poorer countries would become more even, and the income distribution in capital-abundant, richer countries would become presumably less so. Now, of course, the enthusiasts of trade in the esteemed universities of the United States and other countries were not very happy with the second conclusion, much as they were happy with the first conclusion, and so they spilled quite a lot of ink in the late 1990s in particular, trying to come to terms with the fact that, in fact, there was experienced an increase in income inequalities in the United States, and of course, much of the discussion was focused on the increasing inequality between unskilled and skilled workers. Alan Deardorff, Jagdish Bhagwati, and others were among those who worked on this issue and argued that trade could not, at least in the standard view, explain the increases in inequality which had emerged. And of course, the way in which they argued this was to argue that the magnitude of the trade flows which had been experienced would be insufficient to account for changes in the marginal returns to different factors of production which would be required to explain the actually observed changes in rates of remuneration and increases in inequality. And so instead, a deus ex machina was brought in, namely skill-biased technological change. And as you know, the labor economists and others, especially in the United States, spent a great deal of time and energy and spilt a great deal of ink in arguing that skill-biased technological change, whatever that might have been, was the explanation for what was actually observed. Now, to my mind, the actual picture of what has happened in the last 25 years or so in countries around the world is starkly at variance with what was predicted by the model and is very, very hard to reconcile with it. And this is really the motivation for my remarks today. If we look at what actually happened in the developing countries, what we see as many of you will know, is an increase in inequalities, not a decrease in inequalities, and an increase in inequalities of various kinds. Increase in inequalities between the rates of remuneration of unskilled and skilled workers. This has been found in carefully completed study after study in different countries of the world. And also an increase in the capital share, not only in developing countries, but in developed countries. At the same time, as many of you know, in many of the developed countries, there has been a process of hollowing out of the industrial heartland and of the manufacturing sector, which has had very particular kinds of consequences, in particular, or specifically in terms of interregional inequalities. And in the case of countries such as the United States, there have been very dramatic and marked phenomena, such as the median wage stagnation, which has been experienced in the United States. And the capital share, as mentioned, has been seen to be increasing across the world. So we have a phenomenon of increasing inequalities the world over. Not to put too fine a point on it, of course, there are some variations which have to be registered, but in a very large number of countries. And these inequalities, as well as the relative stagnation of living standards of those who are toward the bottom end of the income distribution, cannot be readily understood. Now, as many of you, within the standard framework, as many of you will know, the 2x2x2 model, which gives rather straightforward inferences in relation to income distribution, in particular the Stoper-Samuelson theorem, has no ready analog when one begins to have even a minimal degree of realism in the way in which the model is specified. I would argue that the minimally realistic specification would involve a 3x3x3 model involving upper income countries, middle income countries, and lower income countries, and involving at least three factors of production. In particular, I would suggest capital, land, and labor. Land, as the classical political economists understood the term, not only to include the land on which buildings are built, but indeed all natural resources and all of the gifts of nature. But one could vary that to include, for example, unskilled labor and skilled labor if one wished to do so. And even in such a very simple model, and I would still say vastly oversimplistic model, but perhaps arguably minimally realistic, the possibility to derive any kind of definitive conclusions breaks down. Even in such a context, it becomes challenging to define what one means by more abundant in one factor or more intensive in one factor, let alone to derive acute conclusions. So this is a very interesting case study in the tyranny of ideas, and perhaps not so good ideas which seem rather impressive on the surface because of their ostensible technical sophistication, but actually arguably have very little purchase upon the world, very little empirical traction. So how should we understand the way the world works? I would suggest that if we want to understand the contribution of contemporary globalization to the patterns of distribution within and across countries, we would have to introduce into our analysis at least four causal factors. The first of these, which will be familiar to many of you already, those of you who have studied development, and also those of you who have studied some of the earlier models of international trade, in particular the North-South models, which were somewhat prominent in the 1970s, is the Lewisian character of the global labor market. This refers to the fact that there has been a very large supply of labor available on tap or potentially on tap increasingly around the world at relatively low rates, which is willing to and available to be brought into various kinds of uses without there being any necessity of wage competition. China, for a very long period, arguably was the most important example of this phenomenon. Wages did not rise for any length of time, even as Chinese industrial development took place. Of course, China is perhaps the most dramatic example in world history of a very, very rapid expansion of income over a very short period of time, and had a very labor-absorbing pathway of economic growth, unlike certain other countries, and in particular unlike India, which I hope to also talk about. And that labor-absorbing character of the development process has arguably in recent years finally led to the exhaustion of that labor surplus which Arthur Lewis famously described in his article on unlimited supplies of labor. So that in very recent years in China you have had quite rapid wage increases by Chinese standards, quite rapid wage increases indeed even by regional and world standards, but ones which still considerably lag Chinese productivity growth. And so among Chinese economists and those who are concerned with China, there is the hypothesis that China has reached the kink in the Lewisian labor supply curve at which the labor surplus has been exhausted. Be that as it may, there is much of a labor reserve elsewhere in the world. And a world in which there is a Lewisian labor supply curve is very different from a world in which there is a Samuelsonian upward sloping relationship between labor demand and wages. With the Lewisian labor supply curve, what one has, of course, as Lewis himself recognized, is not only, and this is a very crucial observation which is often neglected, not only that wages can be expected to remain stagnant for a very long period of time while labor is absorbed into various so-called modern sector activities, in particular manufacturing, but also other activities. It could be services or other sorts of activities too. But also that profits will increase in this period. This is a very interesting observation which Lewis made in his original paper, which is often overlooked. One would expect the profit share in national income to increase precisely because of the accumulation of capital over the development process, which allows the marginal product of labor to increase while wages remain fixed at the level of the labor surplus, labor supply curve. Now, arguably, insofar as contemporary globalization has at its very heart north-south trade and the exploitation, as it were, of the Lewisian labor supply on a world scale, something which Lewis himself did not adequately appreciate because he emphasized very much as he was a friend of international trade and believed in the value of international trade for developing countries, he generally interpreted his labor supply curve framework within the national context. We have today a process in which the Lewisian labor supply on a world scale is what matters. And that may well be what has underlain what we might consider to be a period of a sort of profit boom in the world as a whole, associated with the exploitation of the Lewisian labor supply curve. The second and related idea which I would introduce is that of the nature of comparative advantage as constructed and not only extant or naturally occurring. Many of you will know of the extensive work which has been done on East Asian countries such as Korea by people like Alice Amsden, who recently deceased, but also more recently by, well, of course, later by Robert Wade and more recently by Ha-Joon Chang, which points to the role which government has played in enabling countries to climb the ladder of technological upgradation and to actively seek a comparative advantage in various respects. But here I have in mind something not even as dramatic as that, but something much more prosaic. If one asks the question, what is the reason that Chinese industrial goods have been as inexpensive to produce as they have been? Why has China become the so-called workshop of the world? Why is it the case that China makes and the world takes, to echo a sign which is in Penn Station in New York City referring to Trenton, New Jersey? Trenton makes and the world takes. I'm afraid that's no longer true. Why does China make and the world take? Well, the answer is not only that China has low labor costs, because many parts of the world have low labor costs, and in fact, much as that's important, and I don't deny its importance, in fact, my first point was very much to emphasize its importance, but much as that's important, the reason for China's decisive advantages in this historical period have been very much associated with the combination of factors introduced in China which have enabled China to have low unit costs of production. One can engage in a comparison, for instance, between China and Bangladesh in this respect. A few years ago when I looked at this, Bangladeshi wages were much lower than Chinese wages. But nevertheless, the Bangladeshi garment sector was not as cost efficient as the Chinese garment sector. It was enjoying some success, But there was considerable fear about the end of the multi-fiber arrangement and the further access to be given to Chinese garment exports as a result. This was true not only in Bangladesh, but in many garment exporting countries. The difference is this. In Bangladesh, there are so often strikes. The power often doesn't work, and it's expensive. And it unpredictably shuts down, and power has to be generated within factories, if it's or in captive power stations, if at all. The highways and the ports are often choked and are relatively poor and expensive to use, and so forth. Whereas in China, none of these things are true. The enormous investment in infrastructure, which many of you are aware of, which is a feature of the Chinese industrial development path, has ensured that costs are easy to move in, and that goods can be moved in and out easily. And there are few strikes, in part by political design. We know now there are wildcat strikes increasingly, but relatively few, and so on. And of course, there's the intangible of Chinese business culture, which has found a way to gel with the demands of globalization and of Western importers. So the construction of comparative advantage is very crucial in determining the landscape of variation in the contemporary world. And I think we should note, of course, that comparative advantage isn't all that matters. As David Ricardo himself recognized, in the presence of capital flows, which are a feature of contemporary globalization, absolute advantage and not merely comparative advantage can be constructed, which is something I don't have time to talk about right now, but I'll be happy to return to later. It's a fascinating story about how Ricardian economics has been absorbed and interpreted, despite this very important and crucial exception. The third factor which I would introduce is that of rents, and in particular the increase in the scale of rents under contemporary globalization. Now, Ricardo himself, of course, and others understood the relationship between the natural resource sector and the generation of rents. And indeed, it's no surprise that under contemporary globalization, many countries around the world in which there have been fortunes made by billionaires and by others, state-owned enterprises in some cases, as a result of monopolization of the resource sector, are associated with the cornering of such rents. But indeed, it's not possible to understand the scale of the rents without looking at the way in which demand for such natural resources has expanded as a result of globalization. All of you have heard about Chinese demand for natural resources exported from Latin America or elsewhere, Africa. And surprisingly, India. Nobody would have thought, I think, that India would be a net exporter of natural resources before the liberalization in India, but that has come to pass largely for Chinese demand, though not entirely. And this is, I think, yet another illustration of the incapacity of the 2x2x2 model to tell us very much. Of course, a lot of that, in the Indian case, a lot of that supposed comparative advantage is also associated with the difference between the social cost of extracting natural resources and the market price at which it can be extracted, and sometimes political power, what in India is called gundaism. The role of ruffians of various kinds is also very, very important. And in Russia and elsewhere, you can see this very explicitly. And the fourth factor, which I will mention, is that of threat effects. Actually, before I do that, let me just say one more thing about rents, which is that although I've just mentioned and just emphasized natural resource rents, rents can be of various kinds under globalization, of course. If you ask the question, why is Mark Zuckerberg rich? Well, it doesn't have just to do with the fact that he came up with, arguably, Facebook, but it also has to do with the fact that once Facebook exists, and if one is lucky enough to squat on that property, one can generate enormous returns, since it's very difficult to challenge the person or the entity which is squatting there, due to the increasing returns effects of network externalities. Now, I'm not denying here that in the creation of something like Facebook, there is arguably the creation of value, but I do want to point out that under globalization, the scale of the rents to be realized in such processes expands. Finally, I think I'm running out of time, or have run out of time. I want to mention threat effects, which was actually the subject of my unpublished PhD dissertation. Threat effects in international trade can lead in very different, and capital flows can lead in very different directions in terms of income distribution than the standard models. In the presence of threat effects in which enterprises managers and capitalists are able to potentially threaten to relocate production, or indeed entire enterprises, the possibility of striking a better bargain with workers emerges. And very importantly, this possibility does not actually have to be exercised in order for it to lead to that better bargain. It's sufficient that the threat be credible. And so even in industries and in firms which don't actually exercise the threat, there may be reductions in wages. This, of course, requires as a background premise that there should be surpluses which are available to be distributed, and therefore it involves a theoretical framework which is at variance with the zero-profit models of the standard international trade theory. But I think it's far more realistic and much more in keeping with our understanding based on the everyday social reality which has been observed in the last 20 to 30 years in the developed countries, to think that such threat effects are very much at play. And not only in the developed countries, but increasingly between middle-income countries and poorer countries as well, which could potentially generate such threats. Now, since I've run out of time, I'm not going to be able to discuss explicitly as I wish to the two major false dichotomies which I wanted to speak about, but let me just flag them before turning over to my colleagues in case we can talk about them in the course of discussion. I think that the processes of yawning gaps, increasing inequalities in various countries around the world in the course of contemporary globalization have created a world in which the distinction between developed countries and developing countries is increasingly not credible. That similar patterns are emerging in both kinds of countries and for similar reasons. Much as there continue to be, of course, enormous differences in living standards and in income, but the idea that there are causal differences in the way in which these countries' economies operate is not tenable in the context of contemporary globalization, and in particular, our understanding of inequalities and how these inequalities emerge would suggest that. And finally, the distinction between the microeconomic and the macroeconomic is also, in the context of the relationship between the inequalities which have emerged and the macroeconomic fragility or instability in countries, one which is very much placed into question. And I'd be very happy to talk about any of the cases of India, China, the contemporary Eurozone crisis, or indeed the crash of 2008 in the United States and the lead up to it in these terms, because I think in each of these cases one can interpret the macroeconomic fragility and instability which could potentially emerge or which has already emerged in light of the microeconomic patterns which I have described, and in particular the impact of increasing inequalities. So let me stop there and look forward to further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Pleasure to be here and to be able to present my research, my latest research. Let me begin by saying that the presentation will provide a general overview about a few points and conclusions about some of my latest research. And obviously, I will not have time to go into details, but hopefully, I will provide enough food for thought for a later discussion. Let me begin by framing the topic of my talk within the general framework of the conference. What I'm going to talk about today here is mainly about the role of the macroeconomy in influencing the income distribution in the country, and in particular, how major crisis over time has had an impact on income distribution, but also on the other way, on the reverse direction of causality, which means how inequality can have a role in explaining the rise in macroeconomic instability. The major topic I'm going to talk about today is, as I said before, as the title makes clear, is the impact of macroeconomic crisis, especially systemic banking crisis, on top income shares. But before doing that in more details, I would like to discuss and I would like to show you where my research stands with the context of the current debate about the role of inequality in leading to macroeconomic stability. Most of the theories put forward recently in the literature states and more or less suggest that inequality has a role to play in driving the unsustainable surge in household development, household indebtedness. Most of the theories, some of the theories put more emphasis on the role of factors, on the role of supply of credit. Some other theory put more emphasis on the role of demand of credit. I would like to think and to focus more on the demand of credit, because I think that there is more theoretical foundations, especially in macroeconomics, and because theories that grounds in demand of credit have kind of more clear implications which are testable with data. The two main theory that helps explaining why inequality might have a role in driving up the demand for credit for households, I think they are the permanent income hypothesis and the relative income hypothesis. Usually these two theories are thought to be rival, but I would like to talk about those theories as a whole theory that can because I mean they can reinforce each other in determining and explaining why inequality can be driving the demand for credit. In order to understand why this should be the case, think about the recent rise in inequality has been driven by, on one hand, an increase in volatility of earnings over time for individuals. So earnings process become more erratic over time. But also the increase in inequality might have been driven by an increasing dispersion of income between individuals. If these two things happens, then both of the theory have something to say about the role of inequality for driving up the demand for credit. According to permanent income hypothesis, as you all know, only permanent income changes matter for determining the optimal consumption decision. Therefore, if you observe in the reality that your income is becoming more erratic over time, you would like to smooth that out in order to keep your consumption constant, and you borrow in the financial market. According to relative income hypothesis, however, my welfare does not depend only on my level of income, my level of consumption, but will depend also on the income of people around me, and especially on people in the circles of group of reference, as they called. And therefore, when inequality increases within this group of reference, and when people at the top, for example, consume more, what happens is, like, I would like to consume more because I feel slightly more sad about that. So I would like to consume more. I would like to keep up with the living standards. This is a recent theory put forward by Robert Frank, and it's called expenditure cascade theory. So when the income at the top becomes more concentrated, it ripples down through expenditure cascade down to the bottom of the income distribution. And this might create overconsumption behavior, under-saving behavior, and eventually over-indebtedness behavior. How we can make sense of this empirically? Well, obviously, a classic distinction is using microdata and macrodata. I more or less stand in the middle there. What I found useful about this distinction is that due to the nature of the discussion, it seems more plausible that using microdata actually makes more sense, because they will be able to shed more light about the underlying theoretical foundation of the issues. And then, of course, it's not really surprising that most of the studies that have been using macrodata have not found statistical significant relationship between inequality in crisis and inequality and overall credit level in the market. For example, in a recent paper with Tony Atkinson, we've shown that analyzing a series of crises over the past 100 years for 25 countries, and we haven't found any statistical relationship between inequality and the rise in inequality and the occurrence of crisis itself. Similarly, recent work by Bordeaux and Messner didn't find any correlation between top income shares and occurrence of crisis, and especially the occurrence of a rise in credit in the economy. On the other hand, if you start using microdata, like we have done, for example, in a recent work with a colleague of mine at LSE, Paolo Lucchino, we looked into the British Family Expenditure Service, and what we found is that in periods of very high income inequality and increasing level of income inequality, people all across the income distribution started to decrease their saving rate. This is also consistent with what other scholars have found within some empirical studies using microdata in US. So having had this little detour, now I'll step back to the initial step, which is trying to understand what are the major distribution implications of macroeconomic shocks. And I will do that by analyzing the way top income shares responds to major systemic banking crises over the course of 100 years in 27 countries, 28 different countries, representing a third of the world income GDP. We obviously care about understanding who takes the brunt of the recession. We would like to understand whether major crises have some, can mark a turning point for income distribution. But as we said before, we are also more and more concerned about the role of income inequality as one of the main drivers of instability, inefficiency, and distortion in the economy. So if we really believe that this high level of inequality is considered to be inefficient, if we really believe that, and if we really think that major crises can be considered as, let's say, can be the manifestation of the self-correcting forces of markets, then we can rephrase our questions and building on contribution by Emma Rothschild yesterday night, and we can use another classic dichotomy using this state versus government intervention, market versus government intervention, and we can rephrase the question and ask whether actually systemic banking crises are correcting this efficiency or not. As I said, we'll be using the top income shares. These are data drawn from the World Top Income Database, and some of them also drawn from the chart book of economic inequality. Here I depicted a sketch of the right tail of the US income distribution, gross income distribution for tax units. As you can see, here we are talking about the 15.3 million tax units, which earns an income higher than 112,000 US dollars. So there's a lot of people here, despite being a very tiny fraction of population. And what I would like to draw your attention on is the fact that as soon as you move up in the income ladder, for example, if you focus on the top 0.01% of the distribution, here we are focusing on people earning income which is higher than 8.6 million. And on average, these people have around 20 million US dollars. So we're talking about a bunch of heterogeneous households with different level of income and above all, different composition of income. So what we're trying to do here, we're not going to study the whole top decile, but we take as a representative group the very, very rich within the US population. We take as a representative group the top 0.01% of the population. And we also take as a representative group of the relatively poor within the top deciles, the people that stands between the 90th percentile and 95th. So the top 10 minus the top 5. Why are we using top shares? Well, first of all, top shares are not uninformative about the overall income distribution. This has been proven empirically, but also a little bit more formally. But what really matters here is that there is no other database out there that allows you to study the evolution of income inequality over 110 years in more or less consistent way. And this is very important if you study systemic banking crises, which are very rare events in a country's history. So you need to have an historical perspective. The second step in the empirical investigation is to assemble data on banking crisis, assemble data on macroeconomic shocks. We devote a lot of effort in doing that. We focus exclusively on systemic banking crisis, so we get rid of all those crises which are not systemic in nature. We identify 88 crises with a simple method of dummy variable, taking value 1 when the crisis begins, 0 otherwise. We don't try to identify the duration of the crisis itself, because usually it's considered to be one of the very controversial issues in the literature. We also identify other type of macroeconomic shocks, including GDP, real per capita GDP and consumption disasters, defaults in domestic and external debt, currency crisis, hyperinflation period, other types of major wars and civil wars, independence episodes. And we identify a total of 247 macro instability episodes. The third step, obviously, is kind of more setting up the methodology and the empirical specification. Sorry for the technical details here, but I'll try to drive you through. So what we're trying to do is to adopt, given that we have such a long time series of information, we would like to exploit that. So we will borrow from macroeconometric literature, and especially from macroeconomics, and we'll apply these methodologies that are usually more common in this literature within the income distribution literature. This is one of the first applications of this sort within the literature. And we use a very simple ARDL model, which is autoregressive distributed lag model, where GIT here, top, means the growth rate of top income shares at the top for country I at time t. BCIT is the banking crisis dummy variable for country I at time t. XIT is a vector of controls, which we'll be talking about later. UIT, obviously, is the error term. What are we trying to do here? How are we evaluating the effect of the crisis? In practical terms, what we're doing is trying to estimate the total effect of the impulse coming from the crisis, and we're trying to do that through the standard tools of impulse response function. So why is this useful? Is because we treat the banking crisis as an impulse for the series. Thank you. And then we study the response of top income shares over time. And this approach is informative about the duration of the effect, but also about the depth of the impact. There is a complication, and obviously this is easier said than done, because what we need to do here is try to come up with an estimation of the counterfactual. So obviously, what would have happened had there been no crisis in the first place? We don't know. That's a standard problem of a counterfactual, and it's a standard problem of missing of observation. We don't know about that, so we need to estimate it. And obviously, that's where the model comes into place, and that's where the specification of the model comes into place, and especially the role of the controls variable. We cannot simply use any type of controls variables. We follow the ex post counterfactual approach by Peseron and Smith. It's a very recent paper, but it's very clear and neat. And what they say is that in order to calculate and to estimate your total effect, the total impact of the impulse coming from the banking crisis, all you need to have is a reduced form model like this one, where you control exclusively for variables which are invariable to recurrence of the crisis. This has strong implications for the model because crises are not isolated events. They occur with other type of macroeconomic shocks, with other type of macroeconomics events. So do we need to take that into account in the model? Well, according to that, according to this invariances assumption by Peseron and Smith, we don't have to take that into account. And so we get rid of all these control variables in order to calculate the total effect of variables of banking crisis on top income shares. Let's jump to the results because I will not have too much time to dwell on the details. This is the results for the very top of the distribution. This is impulse response function, so the response of top shares to the impulse of the crisis. The bands here are the classic 90% and 95% confidence interval calculated through bootstrapping. And the left panel represents the impact of crisis on the very, very rich. And the right panel represents the impact of crisis on the relatively poorer within the rich group. It's very hard to distinguish this impact from zero here, but it's worth noting the general pattern. A decrease for the very rich, an increase for the relatively poor within the rich. What if, obviously, we are kind of pulling all information together here, all crises across all different epochs for every country in the sample. So what if we split this information and we try to observe a more complex relationship between inequality and crisis? What we do here is we group the countries according to different country groups English-speaking countries, continental European countries, Nordic European countries, Southern European countries, developing countries. As you can see, there is a lot of heterogeneity, but the general pattern is for all the countries in the first row here, the inequality decreases following the crisis. For the developing countries, Southern European countries, inequality increases. What about differences over time? If we get rid of the developing countries and Southern European countries, and if we split the sample between post-1970 and pre-1970 sample, what really happens is that recent crisis seems to have an impact on top income shares which is 3 times as big as the earlier crisis. However, the bottom line is that the magnitude of this impact and the duration of this impact is very small. The impact is very small. The second year following the crisis, the top income shares is around 12% lower than the no crisis scenario, but the total impact is completely absorbed by the 4th year following the crisis. So the punchline is crisis and systemic banking crisis seems not to mark a turning point for the income distribution. The overall impact is very small, and it's absorbed within 4 years following the crisis. And there is obviously some heterogeneity across countries and across time. And it seems to suggest that unless crises are coupled with strong intervention with fiscal policy, or as Anton Korenek was suggesting yesterday, through the intervention through regulation policies, crisis per se seems not to be able to stop the relentless increase in income concentration in countries. This is, the punchline of the research. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to speak about measuring the global distribution of wealth today. But this project that I've been involved in for some years now was the brainchild of Tony Shorrocks when he was the director of the UN World Institute for Development Economics Research in Helsinki. And prior to that, Branko Milanovic and other people had estimated the world distribution of income. And so Tony's idea was that it was time that somebody should try this for wealth. And so we did that, and there's an article about this in the EJ 2011, and more recently we've been doing annual updates in cooperation with Credit Suisse. So just some information there about my collaborators. Okay, so of course for this audience, you don't really need this explanation. Wealth, we need net worth, real assets plus financial assets minus debts. We've got level results for the years from 2000, and the global distribution pattern we estimated in 2000. That's in the EJ article, and we've been doing it for the last couple of years. But basically, we just have 2 snapshots for the global distribution. One of the next things that's on our agenda is to try to study the changes in that distribution over time. Okay, so we haven't exactly done that yet. In what I'm going to tell you about today, we use official exchange rates. We've done it the other way using purchasing power parity. The argument is that for wealth, there's a stronger argument for using official exchange rates than there is for income. Wealth, as we'll see and as people know, is highly concentrated. And if you are a Indian billionaire thinking about investing your money in the UK or Canada or Australia or wherever, what's relevant for you is official exchange rates. And if you're wondering, if you're a rich person, you're wondering which of your 12 homes around the world you ought to, spend the next 3 months in, you have to move some cash over to that country, or maybe acquire another house or whatever. So for consumption purposes for these wealthy people, official exchange rates are more important than they are for other people. Let's see. This doesn't seem to be advancing. Wonder if this will work. Yeah, okay. So there are two aspects to this exercise. One is estimating wealth levels by country. This is household wealth that we're dealing with here. And the other is estimating the shape of the distribution. And these things are done separately, and then the two aspects are put together. There is good household balance sheet data. By the way, this balance sheet data formally is part of the national accounts, the UN system of national accounts. The rich countries have implemented this quite a long time ago. The lower income countries not, but they are beginning to get involved. Chile, for example, has just started publishing its system of balance sheet data. So we have 17 countries that have complete household balance sheet data, and these are the larger and richer countries predominantly. 31 countries that have financial data, so debts and liabilities. And that's supplemented by household survey data for 3 countries. Well, the 3 countries are China, India, and Indonesia. If I was going to give you the historical introduction to this exercise, the first thing we did is we did a little bit of research to find out what data there was for developing countries. In the literature about household wealth and its distribution, that literature has in the past dealt almost exclusively with high-income countries. And there are many comparative exercises, volumes edited by Ed Wolf, for example, and so on. But it's all confined to, okay, so what you discover is India every 10 years surveys household wealth. They do it very carefully. They have a sample size of about 95,000 households. They're serious. China has had wealth surveys every 3 or 4 years over the last 10, 15 years. Indonesia had one survey, but it was sort of a standard wealth survey. Those are, I think, the 3 largest developing countries in terms of population. I think Indonesia is number 3 after China and India. And since we started, Thailand and Chile have come online as well. But at any rate, so we use the household survey data in some cases where there isn't any balance sheet data. Again, this is to establish wealth levels. Here's just a little snapshot of the relationship between wealth and GDP per capita in 2010. That's for the countries that had complete balance sheet data, I believe. And so there is a correlation, but it's far from perfect. You see that, say, Switzerland and Denmark have relatively similar GDP per capita, but they have very different levels of wealth per capita. Okay, so we face this problem. Of course, there are like 200 countries in the world. We have data for 31 in the case of financial assets. Covers about 53% of the population, of the world population is located in countries that have this data. And those countries have about 83% of the world's wealth, according to our estimates. So that's one of the reasons why we're not scared off by the fact that we have to do imputations for many countries. The way we do it is, in the levels data, is we treat liabilities, financial assets, and real assets separately. Well, the financial assets and the liabilities are from the same data source, and so it's balanced. And what we do is use seemingly unrelated regression technique there, and that turns out to be helpful. I'm just showing you one of these regressions here. This is for financial assets. Why do we have log consumption as an explanatory variable? The answer is that it's available for many more. Oh, okay, it's not when you run the regression, it's when you do the imputation. Consumption per capita is available for many more countries than income per capita, okay? And actually, when they estimate the world distribution of income for many of those countries, they're using consumer expenditure rather than income. So it turns out that the estimate that you get here for these countries is very similar whether you use log income per capita or log consumption per capita. So we use consumption because that's convenient for the imputations. And the variables we picked were inspired by the life cycle model of saving, and then we thought about other variables that could come in that would be consistent with the life cycle model. And there's a discussion of this in the EJ article. But you see here, for example, the market capitalization in a country turns out to be a highly significant variable in this regression. R squared is 94%. The elasticity with respect to our income variable is 1.2. For liabilities, it's actually 1.3. So those things increase faster than income, right? And for the real stuff, the elasticity is basically 1. So putting that together, doing our imputations, this is the picture we get for the behavior of aggregate global wealth. It's nominal terms, US dollars, using official exchange rates. So year 2000 was a little bit more than 100 trillion. That went up to this big peak in 2007, 210 trillion sort of, and then took a dive, about $40 trillion, and then since it's gone back up. The decline from 2011 to 2012 is basically, it's an exchange rate phenomenon. So the US dollar went up over that period. The 2012 number is, by the way, is for the middle of 2012, it's like the end of June. So this little decline there at the end is, if you use constant exchange rates, actually it's level. And we have the different regions, and you can see the 3 places where most of the wealth is located are Europe at the bottom, North America, and the rich Asian Pacific countries. China and India we separate out, and those are the next couple of layers, and then Africa and India account for the slivers at the top. I'll skip over that one. Here's kind of a nice map. This is more or less what you'd expect. Here are the centers of world wealth. North America, Europe, rich Asia Pacific, which basically means Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and then countries like Taiwan and so on that have got into that top category of having wealth per adult of over $100,000 US. Wealth levels across countries, the US is not the highest. In mid-2011, these numbers are for, you see Switzerland had average wealth per adult of $540,000. You can see the importance of exchange rates here. Switzerland went up from 420 to 540 in 6 months. That was an exchange rate phenomenon. And then they decided that all things considered, they didn't really want the franc to go any higher than that. So. And then the thing for Japan is also exchange rate stuff. China is almost on a fixed exchange rate with the US, so the increase there is not subject to that same influence. So worldwide, in our 2011 numbers, the average wealth per adult was about $50,000. Now, here's an interesting slide. I'm quite interested in how the wealth-to-income ratio varies across countries. So it's an easy exercise to do after you have our numbers, is to group the countries, sort the countries by their GDP per capita. And what this says here is that if you take the bottom 80% of countries by GDP, that's actually 80%, is an attempt to have 80% of the world's population. You don't get that exactly, but it's okay. Close to that. The wealth to GDP ratio for those countries is about 2. For the top 20%, it's 4. That's a big difference. What this is reflecting is that the wealth gaps across countries are larger, considerably larger than are the income gaps. And I think that's one of the most interesting, some of the results of this were exactly what I would have expected. Wealth is highly concentrated, not surprised. But it turns out that wealth is missing exactly where it's needed the most, right? I mean, rural people living in Ethiopia are subject to a lot of serious shocks, and they don't have a social safety net, right? I think they need personal assets more than I do, living in London, Ontario, tenure and, the whole social welfare system, pensions that'll take care of me if anything bad happens, and hospitals where I can walk in and get free health care, et cetera. So that's pretty ironic. Anyway, that's interesting. Goldsmith was, Raymond Goldsmith, who was a major figure in this field, about 20 years ago, suggested that a ratio of financial to non-financial assets of unity would be what countries would asymptote to. Actually see there in 2011 for the top 20% of countries, that ratio is 1.27. And the emerging market countries, by the way, have a ratio of financial to non-financial assets on average, which is something like 0.75. So they've got a ways to go in terms of more financial development. Now, you won't be able to make out too much of this. What this is now, just moving over to the distributional side. Okay, so our input is, our philosophy to start with was we'd take official data and look at published numbers about wealth shares. This slide shows shares in the top 25%. We also, of course, have the shares in the lower part of the distribution. They're not shown here. They're, of course, they're very low. The quality of data varies a lot. U.S. has a fantastic wealth survey, does a really good job on the upper tail of the distribution, although the Forbes 400 are explicitly excluded from their sampling frame. Of course, you can get that by looking at the Forbes 400 list. Other countries, like the degree of attention you pay to the upper tail is the key thing. And so this is official data. We start with this, but we now do corrections for the upper tail. So we use this published data. We do imputations, use income data to help with imputations for the countries that are missing the data. And it says at the bottom of the slide, we adjusted the top tail to according to the Forbes data. If you don't do an adjustment for the top tail, this is our global distribution. Now, as most of you would know, when you put the log of wealth down here and you put the log of the number of people whose wealth is greater than the X value, on the vertical axis in the Pareto distribution, and Pareto discovered this in income tax data for Europe, is in the upper tail approximates a straight line, okay? Now, most of the drooping that we see in the solid blue line, we think is because the wealth surveys are generally speaking, the United States is an exception, not that great in the upper tail, okay? But who is? Well, Forbes puts out a list of the world's billionaires every year. Here's what we do. This is an example of China. So over here we have $1 billion. You can see there's a little bit of wobbling in the upper tail there. Actually, for China, we have more than billionaires. The Forbes puts out a list of I don't know, the top 50 or top 100 people by wealth in China. So it goes a little bit below the $1 billion level, and it's a little bit wiggly there. But then what we do is we join up a straight line to the distribution that we were getting from the official wealth data, right? So the notion is that for the top 0.1%, the surveys are not that good, but we think they're reliable for the great bulk of the population, us ordinary people. And so put these things together. This is not unique procedure. At any rate, the result you find is wealth inequality is very high. Here's the decile shares. You can see the share of the top 10% is 84.3%. Share of the top 1% is 44%. For comparison, the share of the top 1% in the US is about 40%. Canada is probably about 25%, according to some of the work that I've done. Gini coefficient 0.893, that's getting pretty close to the upper bound. So anyways, the people at Credit Suisse like to illustrate this in the form of pyramid. I'll skip over that because I think this chart is more interesting. So what we have here is we have the world deciles. And then what we're showing is, for the first decile, for example, where are the people living? So the yellow bit is Asia Pacific, and then we have India and Africa. You see India and Africa have a very large share of the people in the bottom decile, right? Over here, top decile, it's Europe, North America, and again, Asia Pacific. It's the rich Asian Pacific countries that are accounting for that over there. Now, the difference in the shapes is interesting. Look at China. We first did this in the year 2000. This great big fat Chinese cigar shape was more over to the left. And we looked at that and we thought, what's going to happen here? Compare that with India. India's got this long, skinny, where's India? There it is. Oh, yes. It's got this more tapered shape, right? And we said to ourselves, well, they're both going to move to the right. China a bit faster than India. But China's got this great big bulky, group of people that are going to move into those upper deciles. And India is going to sort of slowly get in there because of the more tapered shape. And anyways, that turned out to be true. And so now, 8th decile, even the 9th decile, China has very high representation. Latin America has got a more sort of even shape. And actually, in the year 2000, it looked even more even than that. Latin America is kind of a microcosm of the world distribution of wealth. It's also true for the world distribution of income. This is interesting. It shows wealth income ratios for France, UK, and the US since 1900. The US has wobbled around a ratio of 5. This is the wealth to disposable income ratio. Notice that France and the UK showed a substantial trend increase. And despite the fact they've gone down since the crisis, there's still an upward trend there since about the mid-1980s. And a lot of countries have that. Here are all the G7 countries. You can see the general trend is up. Canadian exceptionalism is in there. The red line is Canada, And you see that unlike these other countries who had these, I don't know, strange meltdowns in their financial systems for reasons that, people here in Canada find puzzling, we didn't have that. Okay, Germany also was pretty solid, although they got a little bit of a decline there. This is the debt-to-income ratios in G7 countries. Those have been on a tear. And, of course, what's disturbing for Canada is we're still going up. Our debt-to-income ratio now is 167% in the most recent data, which are not quite in there. But the familiar pattern. And then, of course, there's been a substantial correction in the UK and the US and so on. Okay, so my conclusions. Half of this is sort of about methods. The last two bullets, first of all, wealth differences between countries are greater than income differences. And second one, that wealth and income are imperfectly correlated across countries. So wealth and income are really two different things. I didn't get a chance to talk about this aspect very much, but for example, the general rule is the wealth to income ratio is higher in more developed countries, but the Nordic countries are an exception, right? They have a surprisingly low wealth to income ratio. And we've actually had a fair bit of email over the years from people in Scandinavia saying, come on, what's wrong with you? We really are wealthy here. But simple explanation seems to be they have all these pensions and social safety net and health care and so on. And so the need to build up personal assets is less than it is in, say, a country like the US where there's more personal risk and uncertainty in life. Thanks very much.
Hello. Wonderful. Kevin English from CG and the Balsillie School next door. I had a question for any of the panelists who would like to take a shot at it, but probably for Dr. Reddy. One of the interesting things that I find about you were talking about one of your four major points was talking about what people call keeping up with the Joneses as an explanation that growing inequality and the desire to keep up with stagnant wages led people to basically pile up debt. The interesting thing I find about that, though, is if you toss out the top 1%, the large growth in inequality tends to, at least in the States, can't speak for other countries, tends to flatten out. So if that theory holds, it would seem to me that growing wealth inequality would have to be present in people's daily lives. So if it's just Warren Buffett getting wealthier and wealthier, and the desperate housewives of Miami and whatnot getting wealthier and wealthier, that's still not directly, influencing people's daily lives. So this is one of the aspects of that theory that I've often found a little confusing. Thank you.
I didn't actually speak very directly to the issue you raised about emulation of consumption patterns and inequalities, but it is a very important question. And actually, Bruce Greenwald talked about it a bit during his luncheon address in discussing some of the dynamics which might have been at play in the U.S. But I think it is very important in a number of countries, and it's what kind of macroeconomic effects it has might very much depend on local considerations in some sense. Ragnar Nurkse spoke about what he called the international demonstration effect, whereby the elites in the developing countries emulate the consumption pattern in the developed countries, which they observe at a distance. So although there's a lot of talk in recent literature, the literature associated with Robert Frank and others about reference groups and one's neighbors being more important than distant persons such as Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, in this case, Nurkse's emphasis was actually that the elites in a particular poor country might be much more influenced by how they think people live in a rich country than by anything they see around them. And I think one can see this having considerable micro and macroeconomic consequences in particular countries. In India, for instance, the pattern which has emerged in the islands of prosperity which have come into being, say Bangalore, where I come from, which is a high technology city which is very prosperous now, very globally integrated, but which has really diverged from its periphery, its rural periphery and other parts of India. That pattern is very import intensive because of this emulation of lifestyles elsewhere. And that in turn has had macroeconomic consequences for India. Because India, unlike China, has a negative trade balance and it has to pay for its pay for that with receipts from investment, and therefore maintain the confidence of foreign investors, which creates a whole different macroeconomic dynamic. So I think the story which would have to be told is is probably somewhat localized, but I don't doubt that such dynamics are important, I would say.
If I may add something. Your suggestion is quite correct in the sense that if you assume that the bottom of the distribution does not have any dispersion of income, but is, let's say, flat on level X of income, and only the top of the distribution shoots up, then obviously, yeah, you are in trouble in the sense that this theory doesn't really work because these people at the top are too far from you and you're not able to emulate them. But the real empirical fact is that, and is what Robert Frank and his co-authors argue, is that if you divide income inequality according to the standard division between groups and within groups, and if you observe that, in fact that inequality in US and other countries has been driven by both of these components. Within group inequality and between group inequality. And if you assume that, for example, this is our group of reference now, and for sure there is some inequality of income here, and I'm going to draw on that, dispersion of income, which is the one I observe, and similarly, the dispersion of income in my region, in my neighborhood, for sure there is a lot of that, and this is what. And therefore, the next step there is assuming that the society runs in a form of overlapping circles, where within group inequality has an impact overall in the aggregate level of savings because of this rippling down effect. Obviously, if these groups were separated independent by assumption, then obviously you don't have that effect. But in principle, they are overlapped, and within groups inequality affect a lot the overall distribution.
Thank you for such a great talk. I have 3 questions, one for each members of the panel. My first question is for Professor Reddy. And if I understood correctly what you were saying, the 4 factors were constructed to understand globalization at the international level. If one wants to apply this framework for a particular country, how viable it is, this framework, to study the impact of globalization in a particular country? I was thinking about the effect of the export sectors in particular countries, how globalization actually has developed these sectors, and then depending on how strong are the linkages, using Hirschman's words, the backward and forward linkages between these dynamic sectors in the economy, trade actually might have positive effects in this particular country. But if these linkages are not strong enough, then trade might not have such a strong impact. So I would like to hear more about an elaboration of applying your framework to a particular country. For Salvatore Morelli.
I'm sorry, there are a number of other people who want to ask questions. We're almost out of time. I think maybe we should ration the questioners. Don't you think? One question per questioner might be a good idea. There's only 1 minute left.
Or perhaps we could collect all the questions. I don't know when we're supposed to end. We can question another 5 minutes.
Okay.
So maybe we could collect all the questions and then answer them together.
Maybe answer them concisely. Okay.
Yes, so this research that Salvatore Morelli that you presented on the balancing effect from how inequality again adapts after the financial crisis in the top income shares, obviously raised the question in the reverse direction, and also connecting to the effect that financial markets globally have not on income but on wealth distribution, which also relates to the two last points that you made, Sanjay, Reddy, on rent extraction and threats, which you shortly mentioned, and that you also wanted to mention again. So the question I have, which parts do you think of the global financial system, that is institutions, basically institutions drive global wealth inequality? Thank you.
What's the question directed to you?
I think that was for all of us. I think so.
Yeah, just one quick question. Isn't it one of the maybe the most dangerous false dichotomies to posit that there is such a thing as the rich and the poor, say in developing countries such as India and China, especially when we evaluate, say for example, 300 million people in China being lifted out of poverty. They may be poor in terms of market-based income, but previously they could not be described as poor. The same thing, the opposite happens, say for example in Scandinavia. So can we use wealth as market-based income and use the positive connotations that are there in the subcontext of this word to then say yes, it improves the lives of people, when basically in terms of maybe the labor units they're consuming in terms of their disposable income actually has been reduced, but just the paper currency that's on their bank account has increased.
Take those three questions and then we have 3 minutes left. Go backwards, Jim?
Yeah, no, I think the point that you were just making about the position of the people in China who've been raised out of poverty is very interesting, right? I'm not quite sure what you're getting at. It sounded like you were suggesting that to some extent their increase in wealth might be something that's on paper but isn't real as a matter of fact. Right? Yeah, I think there's something to that. Right? I'd like to talk to some of the people who've made the move and ask them whether they think they're better off or worse off. Do they think that their real wealth has increased or fallen? I'm not quite sure what they would say.
Just to add a quick thing, yeah, obviously there is an issue of, I'd say, real wealth. Nobody has attempted to measure real wealth besides the net worth, net of liabilities. But usually, there is no such a thing of like wealth price index or something like that. That usually can deflate the assets. So yeah, it's in a.
Thank you. First, Luis, on your question, I'm sure your questions for the other two panelists would have been as interesting, but sadly we could only ask one. I think you're absolutely right. Of course, it all depends on the particular structures which pertain. And indeed, Hirschman's idea of backward and forward linkages between a sector and other sectors in an economy is very important. Do you have islands of prosperity which are disconnected from their contexts, or do you have and which don't demand from them or supply to them in a way which makes them more productive and remunerative, or do you have some type of more vital integration? And I think that's becoming an issue, which is crucial in a number of countries around the world in the patterns of inequalities which are emerging. I should say that I did intend to speak about patterns of inequality within countries and how they are shaped by global factors. I was not talking about inter-country inequalities, though that's also important, but that was not my topic, just to be clear. On the question regarding finance and rents, of course, it's very important. I didn't mention it in my presentation, but reading between the lines, you would see that there is a connection between the phenomenon of threat effects, for example, which are made possible through globalization, the global profit boom related to the exploitation of the Louisiana Labor supply curve, and the possibilities which have emerged in global finance in the last 20 to 30 years. If one thinks about why the City of London or New York City are preeminent financial centers, of course that owes a lot to particular histories and the fact that certain standards have emerged, financial standards in some sense, and the increasing returns related to social networks and so on. There are some regional centers which have emerged, but to a very large extent, the surpluses which have been extracted or which have developed due to these changes are being recycled through the financial system, and so and creating large rents there in that sector, which in turn are contributing to inequalities within the countries where those financial operations are located. On the last point, regarding the nature of wealth and poverty, of course, you're asking a very crucial question, and it was spoken to this morning in talking about Buddhist economics and many, and I think it will emerge again. Look, wealthy people pay large amounts of money to go to places on holiday where they can breathe clean air and see trees and expanses which are not polluted visually. But a lot of poor people have actually had access to clean air and such expanses. Turns out that until recently, poor people who lived in coastal areas could quite easily take in protein intake in the form of seafood, which is increasingly becoming difficult to do because all of it has been taken away by gigantic trawlers from distant countries. But there are many ways in which we don't account properly for what is poverty and what is wealth, even in the material dimension, let alone the immaterial dimension.